Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
To A Fork in Time, everyone. This is Dylan. I've taken the What If machine for a spin. Nobody else knows. We broke out of the garage. We're like the Blues Brothers. We're 90 miles from Chicago. It's midnight. We got half a pack of cigarettes, and we're on a mission from God. My co-Blues brother today is Evan Buck, and we're going to take the What If machine back for a little further back than we normally do. A lot of times we stick to sort of the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, but we're going to go back to the Middle Ages. We've got ourselves a kick. And we're going to go back to an area that's a little bit not, as understood, especially by a lot of Western European audiences. We're going back to medieval Africa, specifically the Empire of Mali. Basically, this is a medieval empire that, sort of arose in kind of the late Middle Ages in the 1300s and onward. That in those of you who may be looking at an atlas while you listen to your Fork in Time episodes, this is centered around Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, obviously a little bit of modern day Mali. Basically, this sits right on the edge of the Southern Sahara and into the sort of river basin as you get into the jungles, sort of on the southern, western part of Africa. So that's where we are. And specifically, we're going to talk about one of the richest men, not just in Africa, but in the entire history of the world. The real life inspiration for Mr. Smithers from The Simpsons, not really, but that's the headcanon that I have. Mansa Musa himself, the man who is worth at least $200 billion. So take that, Elon Musk. Let's see you catch up to that.
Yeah, eat your heart out, Elon.
Yeah, Elon's a real popular guy around Memphis. I can only imagine what he's like in California right now. So basically, Mansa Musa, he was one of the richest to a lot of people, medieval rulers in the entire history of the world. I mean, this man almost had more money than God. That is not a joke. I mean, this is how much he had. The man famously took a pilgrimage and basically bankrupted the entire kingdom of Egypt because he inflated the value of gold so much because he was just throwing it away.
Literally just because he could.
Yeah, he threw gold out and screwed up entire medieval kingdoms.
He basically was basically just like, yeah, I'm coming through and I am going to pay for everything in gold way more than is necessary. I'm just kind of here to strut my stuff. And yeah, it literally depressed the gold market in Egypt for at least a decade after he left. So that kind of just goes to show the power and the prestige that this individual had. Yeah.
So we've kind of set the stage. We've set up the man. What exactly is our fork? What are we going to do to this poor $200 billion worth Malian emperor today on A Fork in Time?
Yeah, I know. Unfortunately, we at A Fork in Time like to find plausible forks for organ trailing a lot of unfortunate individuals in history to kind of make for our fork. And so in today's episode, what we're going to do is we are going to have our unfortunate king, Mansa Musa, perish in some fashion along the return trip from his pilgrimage to Mecca. And so in our timeline, Mansa Musa passed away probably in about 1332 or 1337. It depends on who you talk to, whether you talk to the oral traditions of Africa or, some of the more medieval scholars, somewhere in the 1330s. So our fork is going to have Mansa Musa dying an untimely death on his return trip around 1325. And this is actually not really a very far-fetched idea. Original sources document the various difficulties that the travelers encountered on the return trip, a threat of bandits, lack of food and water, sickness, all those sorts of things. So it was a rather perilous journey back. And part of the reason why is because Mansa Musa did deplete so much of his reservoirs of wealth on the trip there that by the time he came back, he had to be a little bit more thrifty, shall we say. Imagine that, $200 billion man having to be a little bit thrifty. So yeah, that's what our fork in time is going to be, and we're just kind of going to be exploring those little tributaries and rivulets of what might have happened if Mansa Musa passed away. So during this time, Europe was in the middle of the Dark Ages, 1300s or so. Islam has been spreading pretty rapidly. The Moors, for example, they're occupying Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula. And arguably, at this point, the Islamic world is more advanced in learning and civilization than the Christian West. And something that's kind of important to set up to understand like the Empire of Mali a little better is that the Malian Empire became Islamic largely due to trade. So we think of things like, the Silk Road, this whole transcontinental, system between China and the Middle East and Europe. So trade routes were also very important for sub-Saharan African history. And the North African Berbers, which were primarily Islamic, would trade salt for West African gold. And if you think about that, you might think that one side got kind of a raw deal. But when you realize that salt is kind of necessary for living and was a highly priced commodity back in that time period, gold was also, of course, very highly valued. But be that as it may, the Malians were more than happy to part with their gold to obtain what was an extremely valuable and necessary resource. So the Berbers would carry their religion with them to the Malian Empire, and thus Islam was the religion of the traders, the ruling class, the elites. And so the Mansas, side note, I believe Mansa is actually not Mansa Musa's first name. I believe it's like his honorary
it's like the title, right?
Yeah, I believe it's his honorary title, the Mansas of Mali. Yeah, so I don't actually know. I didn't research enough to know what his real first name is, but we'll just call him Mansa Musa for operational purposes. So the Mansas of Mali would primarily preside over largely non-Islamic populations, and they by and large stuck to more so traditional African folk religions. So the interesting thing about our $200 billion man, Mansa Musa, is he came to power in 1312. The previous king, Abu Bakr II, disappeared at sea. Musa was regent while Bakr was away, and he assumed the throne when it became clear that Bakr would not return. Bakr is actually known as the Lion King, and if you want to dig into like his backstory, he was actually the inspiration for the very famous franchise Disney movie, The Lion King. So Bakr II had departed on a large fleet of ships to explore the Atlantic Ocean and never returned. Dylan, I'm just going to put a little plug in here right now. I think it'd be kind of another interesting follow-up on this episode if we wanted to do that, on what if the Mali Empire found the New World before 1492. I think that'd be a really interesting one. What do you think?
I think if we don't at least touch on it in this episode, I think that could be very interesting to come back to, because especially those of you who have listened to some of my episodes where we bring up colonization, that's kind of one of my weird little niche areas of interest. So I think it could be very entertaining to see what kind of screwed up world we can imagine once we start getting to that point. So we'll see. Maybe we'll touch on it a little bit this episode. I imagine it'll at least come up somehow in the conversation, given the time period. But if we don't get to it a whole lot, I think that could certainly be worth coming back to.
Something to think about.
So I guess we've got Mansa Musa dying in 1325. I guess the first kind of question is, what does this do to the Malian Empire if he doesn't come back? Like, does this does this turn sort of Mali into like a Game of Thrones situation? Are people spending the next 12 years like duking it out for the throne, or is it kind of there's a couple people waiting in the wings? Is it more of a cultural shift that doesn't happen because Musa comes back? I guess before we start jumping around like we always love to do, what is the home situation look like when poor King Mansa Musa catches dysentery, trying to hunt for his wagon trail? He's trying to reach Oregon, but they don't realize that Oregon's a continent away, so he's just never going to get there. What happens when he doesn't show back up at home?
Yeah, exactly. So the thing about Mansa Musa and how the Mansas, as far as I understand, the political structure is it was fairly decentralized. Like it's kind of, kingdoms, chieftains of local areas. He was like the head honcho, the big cheese of the Mali Empire, but a lot of the actual like day-to-day governance was delegated out to like local leaders. It doesn't mean the Mansas weren't important. They were still very important for the nation at large. But as I made reference to, Abu Bakr II, which was the predecessor to Mansa Musa, he disappeared at sea. And so Mansa then just took on the emperorship, the kingship. I don't know what to call it, the Mansa ship. I don't know. He took on the Mansa ship after Abu Bakr did not return. And in our timeline, once Mansa Musa perished, his son took over in his stead. So my understanding is it's like the traditional kingdom, sort of descendants of the royal line kind of situation. And in our timeline, Mansa Musa's son is not very notable. I find that a little surprising because I imagine if you inherit $200 billion and an empire that is growing pretty strong, kind of has subdued their enemies, that sort of thing, I would have imagined that.
That's the kind of thing that's at least going to make the New York Times tabloid page, if nothing else.
Yeah, exactly. And so in our timeline, there is somewhat of a little bit of a Game of Thrones intrigue. What ends up happening is Musa's son, which I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but Musa's brother, Musa's son's uncle, Suleiman, ends up taking over. And we don't really exactly know how he did that. He might have deposed Magha, that's his name. So Mansa Magha is the next ruler of Mali. And so I think what would have happened is if the plausible scenario is if Musa had perished on the way back, this, of course, the lineage would have continued. Mago would have taken the reins and taken the throne. But this would have, I think, imagined led to a much more destabilized Malian empire because there's a couple of important things that haven't happened yet. So at this stage of Musa's reign, once he arrives back from the Hajj, that's when he starts really making Mali great again, I guess you can say. Is Musa just comes along and he starts really investing in building up infrastructure, building up Islamic centers of learning, really investing in the civilization of Mali. And none of that would have happened. None of that would have happened if he had died on his return trip from Mecca. So you end up having Maga take over a fairly wealthy kingdom, but one that does not have all of the components that made Mali really prosper in the mid to late 1300s. So I personally feel that, none of the architectural development, none of the cultural development of two major cities, Gao and Timbuktu, I think there would have been a much more publicized power struggle between Maga and Suleiman. And the Mali Empire probably would have declined a lot faster because at this point, remember, Abu Bakr also perished while on travel. So you would have had two Mansas in a row who died or disappeared under fairly mysterious circumstances. I think that would have been very destabilizing. But what do you think, Dylan?
Well, the thing that immediately came to my mind is that, when terrible things happen to one person, that's an accident, a horrible, random fate. When bad things start happening to two people in a row, then you start going, I wonder if there's something here. And then especially if we start seeing bad things happen to three or more people, it's like, okay, there's a game going on here that I don't want any part of. So
we have like a Roman Empire, Roman Republic, Roman Empire, possibly sort of thing. Where different generals are vying for power.
Exactly.
Uncle, that probably would have been a very likely outcome of this, I imagine.
Well, and I also wonder, do you know if Musa's father or any of his predecessors were I guess as devoted to the Islamic world as he, I guess, evidently was? Because the Hajj is a very big deal. I mean, even there are Muslims today who, granted, a lot of people today all over the world don't have $200 billion. So that makes a lot of pilgrimages much easier. But, the Hajj is still a religious rite that's expected of Muslim believers. if they can manage it just one time in their life. I mean, this is a goal that a lot of people, just to even attempt it sometimes is a huge deal. So, is this a thing that's, got some roots in Mali? Because where I'm going is, if it is, and then you have two leaders die of sort of at least semi-mysterious circumstances, I can see how that might allow some sort of religious pushback if there's not an entrenched, Islamic, groundswell already in the empire. I can imagine some conservative religious forces under whatever, other religious sort of, milieu is in the empire, either using that as an argument of, oh, look, these guys are converting to the new faith instead of following the old traditions, and our ancestors or whatever have you, were striking them down. I wonder if that's at play, and then I also wonder just what would be left of the Mali Empire once all of this dust settles. Kind of two very different places I want to go, but I don't know enough to really know what would happen either way.
Yeah, I'm not terribly familiar with all the implications of that. What I'm aware of is that according to like the oral traditions of Africa, coming from that time, and Mansa Musa's account of what happened to his predecessor, it seemed that they all seem to suggest that this was a rather, from their point of view, impractical voyage that was made. I think it was made more so for discovery and science, those sorts of reasons. I don't think it really had anything to do with religious fervor or, spreading the Islamic faith.
Yeah, or at least that was kind of a backseat to sort of the other advantages that would have come along with it, kind of deal.
Yeah, economic sort of advantages. Yeah, so that's my understanding. It is interesting, because like Mansa Musa was a very, devoted to his faith, as you noted. The Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, being like kind of the main, sort of activity or major activity for a devoted Muslim to do. So I think you make a very good point that if you, one strike, two strikes, three strikes, you're out kind of thing. It's like, yeah, okay, maybe you could write off one as him making kind of some impractical or self-seeking, self-serving kind of choices. I think if Mansa Musa perished on his way back from the Hajj, it would have been like the second strike, and he probably would have then been seen as incredibly foolish. Like very, very negatively impacted, I think, in terms of his impact on history. I think, he would have been seen as, okay, so your predecessor decided to take a big risky voyage. Now, it might not have been for, religious reasons. It was for economic reasons or personal glory reasons, but that still ended poorly. Then you yourself didn't end up planning out a really successful, land-based voyage, I guess you can say. So where does that leave your son and, the uncle and all these, and, the Roman Republic sort of drama that has been created? So I think it would have been interesting to see if this would have really changed his legacy, because if we look back on him as, a cautionary tale of excessive, lavish spending, leading to poor planning. The fact that it did pan out the way it did, and Musa was able to come back and, really grow the Malian Empire, really build up Timbuktu, really build up Gao. I think it's pretty fortunate for our $200 billion man, because otherwise, if this other fork in time transpired, then I think it would have led to some rather negative consequences for not only his legacy, but also the Malian Empire.
Yeah. Do you have just, and this, you don't have to have an exact date for this, but just kind of a ballpark. So, Musa dies on the return from Mecca in 1325.
Yeah.
Instead of 1330 something in the real timeline. When do we think this sort of Game of Thrones-esque situation, or this sort of, political power struggle, whether it devolves into outright war or is just, kind of Byzantine scheming, I guess is kind of maybe not necessarily relevant for the point of the question. When do you think that all would maybe settle? And I'm presuming Suleiman would probably still end up the victor. When do you think all that dust settles with Suleiman on the throne in this kind of alternate timeline? Are we
Yeah,
thinking earlier in like the 1330s, or is it kind of in the 1340s?
Yeah, so I think if I remember right, Maga the son didn't really rule very long. He only reigned for I think maybe about 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
So if we want to take maybe even a little bit of less time just because the instability sort of thing. And here's the thing as well is Musa took over and assumed the throne after Abu Bakr never returned. But this would be a situation where we actually know for a fact.
Yeah, there's other people that report. Yeah,
he's dead, Jim. Like he's not here anymore. So Maga would be able to take over right away.
More definitively, yeah.
More definitively. But I think that would also probably lead to a shorter reign. Suleiman would probably be sitting there and being like, hey, like, this guy,
get out of the way.
Come on, kid, get out of the way. Like, it's my turn. You're just kind of warming the throne for me, sort of thing. So yeah, if we say like maybe 2 years or so after Maga takes over, that would put Suleiman on the throne around 1327, roughly, if I'm doing the math right.
Yeah. Okay. And so the reason why I was kind of curious is because, one of the reasons that, and obviously when you have that much material wealth, people in the same region of the world are going to hear about you. But one of the things that really, I think, helped at least the sort of legend of Mali is the writings of Ibn Battuta, who came from 100%. Mali in 1352, if I remember correctly. For listeners who don't know, Ibn Battuta is the man who did not understand what sore feet were, because the man traveled like it's something stupid. It was like if you averaged out the total distance that he traveled over his entire life, it averages out to like 40 miles a day for 80 years or something crazy.
Yeah,
like that.
And he traveled 73,000 miles.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. This is the most well-traveled man in history to this day, if you account for like sheer actual physical traveling, not just people who fly in planes.
And this is before
like actual
planes,
boots on the ground, manual traveling.
Yeah.
So he comes through Mali in 1352, and he's a very well-known Muslim writer. So a lot of his works get spread through the Arab world. But obviously, as we know, that does eventually kind of snake its way into Europe and the kind of the wider world. Not that the Islamic world at this time is not wide enough as it is, but does Suleiman having more time on the throne present any kind of a different picture for Ibn Battuta? I imagine kind of at the beginning, it almost gives him more to write about, not less. But
yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that there would be more to write about, but what would it be more writing about?
Yeah.
Like, because what Ibn Battuta's accounts really show is a extremely developed, relatively advanced, culture. And, Islam kind of much more permeating, down to more of the common folk. Yeah. Timbuktu being built up, all those sorts of things. If you don't have Timbuktu built up, if you don't have Gao built up, and it's still a wealthy kingdom with Suleiman at the head, or Suleiman's descendant at that point, maybe if Ibn Battuta was coming through in the 1530s or 1350s. I think there'd probably be more. There'd be more details on kind of the Game of Thrones power struggle, but in terms of what the focus probably would be more on the material wealth of the country as opposed to the
sort of
cultural heritage, which Battuta, of course, was very, very invested in. Kind of as a side note, because we've been mentioning Timbuktu a lot. Timbuktu is an actual place. You can go visit there today. It's not some sort of mythical city, but you might have heard of that as like the expression, from here to Timbuktu. Like, oh, it's going to take me forever to find this book of mine could have, disappeared between here to Timbuktu kind of thing. I feel like another kind of little small, but also somewhat large cultural reverberation from this is that Timbuktu would probably not have become a shorthand expression like we know it today for like a faraway, mysterious place. Mm-hmm. And I think this has big implications for things like European colonization, because in the 18th century, Timbuktu, once, all these accounts from Ibn Battuta and all these other people kind of trickled back to Europe, this city, it almost kind of became like an El Dorado kind of thing, or an Atlantis sort of thing. It became like this obsession with a lot of Europeans wanting to find this mythical lost city of immeasurable wealth. And so I think this really contributed a lot to this, 17th or 18th, 19th century sort of race for Africa, in a sense. I think that Europe would not have been as aware of Africa's vast wealth until later. And because there's no, sort of, you know, cultural understanding of Timbuktu.
Yeah.
So, and we already are, like, as we alluded to at the beginning of this episode, the West is kind of by and large not really very knowledgeable about this part of African history as things stand. Now, even though Mansa Musa was the wealthiest man to ever live with $200 billion, you might have heard the name Mansa Musa. You have probably heard the name of Timbuktu, but we're not as educated on this part of African world history as we probably would want to be. And so I think a big implication of this is that, historical stereotypes of Africa, kind of seeing the whole continent as this one big monolithic society of just, witch doctors and tribesmen and that kind of thing. That might have become even more ingrained in the Western understanding and the Western psyche of Africa. And so I think this has like a big implication, like the ripple effect when you throw the stone into the pond. I think that's probably one of the biggest ripple effects.
Yeah. And I guess since we've mentioned Europe, we can kind of sort of adventure up there and see what we think. So just to kind of set the stage. So we're talking, the 1330s and 1340s in Europe. This is kind of the end of the High Middle Ages. This is the last kind of sort of abortive attempts at crusades to take back the Holy Land, but even they're not really trying. The 100 Years' War starts in 1337, so this is going to be sort of the big conflict that most of us will have sort of abstract references to, of England versus France, the Plantagenet kings of England fighting to sort of, regain a lot of their lost territory in France, the French kings trying to assert their control and centralization over what becomes the modern French state. You've got the Kingdom of Castile kind of finally starting to really gobble up a lot of the other kings in Iberia, and Portugal's, of course, doing its thing. And the Muslims in Andalusia they're not on the back foot yet, but the writing is on the wall. They're about to start having to deal with that. And further east, you've got the Holy Roman Empiring, as it does, and then in kind of the Byzantine area, you've got the beginnings of the very, very, very sort of progenitor beginnings of the Ottoman Empire. I want to say Osman the First, the guy who the empire is named after, is ruling around this time, but he doesn't really have an empire outside of sort of small territories in Anatolia yet. So this is kind of the arena that we're at, but this is a time when Europeans have full knowledge of, at least that there is something cooking in the Arab world. Those guys have all the cool spices. They have all the cool clothes.
Yep.
They know how to write. They know how to arithmetic. They don't have to take their shoes off to count past 10. There is some magic going on over there. So I think, I wonder what this change in Mali, and this is kind of where we start getting into our more hypothetical, less sort of concrete, prognostications that we do. I wonder what this kind of slightly different, but also very different Mali would have in terms of the European perception and the kind of European experience. Because I don't think it's far-fetched to say that there were at least some explorers, not any of the famous ones that we know yet, but at least some explorers who were at least starting to try and get down into Africa, at the very least, because of all this salt, this gold, this ivory that they've heard stories about, that, you may have pirate bands and the occasional trader wanting to try and get access to, sort of in this beginning age of exploration. You got any big ideas that seem like they might jump out?
Yeah, well, I think that's honestly a really fascinating, train of thought to think about. Something that I also just kind of fact checked myself on, and I'm like, oh, this is interesting to think about as well. And so I'll just throw this into the pot because why not? Is the Black Death is starting to
like 1315, right?
Actually, according to what I'm looking up here, it really started in 1346. So by all accounts, according to my, quick research that I've done here, the Black Death did not really seem to hit sub-Saharan Africa, all that strongly. It seemed to be mainly a thing that was happening in Europe. But I'm just thinking about this idea, this implication of if Mali is, less stable, not as well known already, and so Europe is maybe this idea of the delay in knowledge of what's going on in their parts, a little bit of a delay in that knowledge, and then the Black Death happens. So would this have possibly incentivized more exploration or trying to seek out, other lands, other resources? Because if you don't know what's out there, then I feel like you're going to want to probably, send people out to try and figure out what's going on. But it would have been much less known. So we wouldn't have had as interesting of accounts from Ibn Battuta. It would have been more about the political intrigue and it's there's a lot of gold there. There's a lot of resources there, but the Mali Empire would not have reached the zenith that it did in terms of like cultural understanding. And so, Europe is not quite as aware of what's going on. Then the Black Death happens, and now there's this sort of so in our timeline, the Mali Empire mainly collapsed because of new trade routes that were discovered and opened up by Portugal. There were some other gold fields, some other things that were happening kind of to the south of Mali. And so they no longer monopolized trade in that region. And notably also in our timeline, the Mansas, pretty much after Suleiman, they were, in our timeline, pretty much Roman Republic, Roman Empire, Game of Thrones sort of civil wars. So as a result, the Tuaregs sacked Timbuktu, and then the Songhai took over most of the Malian territories by the 1460s. So things, didn't really last all that long, maybe another like 150 years at most. So if we look at an abbreviated Malian empire, I think honestly that probably would have accelerated European discovery or exploration efforts for the New World. I don't think it would have been accelerated exploration of or expansion into Africa per se, because there's less knowledge about what's going on there. And maybe you disagree. I've been kind of motor mouthing for a little while, but if that were the case, then I think that has really interesting implications as well for the slave trade.
Yeah, I think I can see why you go there. I was originally thinking that Europeans would actually be potentially more interested in Mali, more just because of the time period that we're in. Cross-oceanic voyages are more problematic because there's, we're 100 years earlier. There's some naval technology and some naval developments that don't quite happen yet. You don't have the, you're in kind of a, one generation earlier from the ships that you really kind of need to do cross Atlantic. I mean, you can do them. It's much easier with the ships that Columbus has 140 years later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there is a, I do think you're onto something in the whole, there's less mystique about that part of Africa. I wonder if that the Mali exploration is the sort of initial spark, just because they hear these stories of this wealthy area that can't get itself together. Rich people will always try and take opportunistic advantage of places that they can easily steal valuable things from. So maybe that's the angle. And
that could be. That could be. Maybe we could see more of like, Spanish conquista. And it might not be Spain, but like just some sort of something along those lines, first kind of taking place more in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah. And even, it doesn't even have to be, necessarily a ton of real sort of colonial outposting. I can imagine sort of some trade forts and things that they take. But the reason why I'm going there is because Brazil is much closer to that part of Africa than, the Atlantic coast of North America is from England and France and Spain. And there are rumors that even the Phoenicians and the Romans ended up finding, parts of the Amazon and Brazil. So I think it's certainly an easy.
And there's rumors that the Malians actually did end up in Brazil. There are rumors of that, and there's no, DNA yet actually proving that. And of course, Bakker never made it back, but that is a possibility.
Yeah, and I think it's at the very least, if you have some people like the Portuguese or the pre-Spanish Castilians or even the Andalusians, who at this point are still very much in, not necessarily one of the premier powers of the medieval world. They are at least still around. So you can kind of imagine them maybe trying to hook up with Mali as this Islamic empire that could potentially help fund their, defense against the Catholic, aggressors. It's not hard to imagine that people, once they get to Mali, they start saying, okay, maybe let's go see what's off the coast. And then if some of them, running into what is now Venezuela and Brazil and all that. So I guess in that sense, does that then make, assuming we have a sort of scramble for the new world that seems to be kind of brewing, let's say 100 years, because a couple decades of people, gallivanting, trying to steal gold and ivory off the Malian coast, say, by the 1380s and 90s, that then they start looking for further things. And, then, late 1300s, they get to Brazil. What does that do to the sort of understanding that we have of the colonization? Because instead of, us having the French and the British and the Dutch and the Swedes and the Germans and everybody trying to get in North America, you instead have the Portuguese, the Spanish, your old colonial favorites, the Andalusians, maybe even the Mali themselves, going after South America instead. What does the Treaty of Tordesillas look like in this timeline when you have a pope and a caliph?
I have the Wikipedia for Treaty of Tordesillas pulled up right when you were saying this, because that's exactly where my brain was going. Treaty of Tordesillas happens in our timeline in 1494. And so I think we would have probably seen some sort of treaty of early Tordesillas.
A treaty of Timbuktu, maybe?
A treaty. See, that's the thing, is that, if the Malians are a party to this, like, that's just kind of a wacky thing to think about, because we think of course, European colonization and, all of them basically kind of writing the rules of the game, and the natives don't really have a say at this. But what if we had like an African empire that was also party to this? Like, that would be really interesting.
Well, and I think that presents a couple, and this may end up being a little more of a religious episode than we tend to get on A Fork in Time, at least in terms of the historical discussion. But there, I'm keep stumbling along things in my memory that makes this period in time and this situation religiously and exploratively that we're dealing with a very interesting boiling point. Because so in Europe in the late 1300s, this is in the middle of that whole Italian popes versus French popes thing, where the papacy moves to Avignon, and then after that there's like 4 anti-popes at once, and it's like the meme of Spider-Man where everybody's pointing at the other Spider-Mans. Nobody knows which one's the real one. Yeah. But at the same time, the Islamic world is kind of shifting from, the Islamic heartland of the Levant and Mesopotamia. It was in Baghdad and sort of east in Persia for a while. And then the Mongols sack Baghdad and basically render it not completely irrelevant from a population center standpoint, but culturally it's almost wiped off the map in terms of new developments. So you have this kind of ping-ponging of the Islamic centers of culture going from, the center to the east, back to the center, maybe to the west.
It could become the west.
with this connection to Mali, and then this new discovery, because you have the Mongols and then especially the Timurids, who are about to come in the picture after this. So you may start seeing not just a religious kind of dipole of Islam between Shia and Sunni. You may also see a geographic kind of dipole of Islam.
Yeah, like a shift of the center of power.
Yeah, almost like how you see in Europe during the Reformation, where you have sort of Catholic France and Spain as your sort of Catholic West, and your Protestant sort of North Germany and England, your sort of Northeast versus Southwest kind of dipole of Christianity, or your Catholic, Europe versus the Orthodox East kind of dipole. So I wonder if that may come into this thing. Basically, that whole kind of diversion to say, I wonder if there would be such a thing as a clean kind of Treaty of Tordesillas, because nobody would know which pope can sign it. So you may end up seeing a bunch of competing treaties. Maybe, here's an idea. Maybe all of this uncertainty around the political, the religious affiliation, maybe we see a religious age of piracy.
Ooh.
Now, this, listeners, before you go on this journey with me, I have nothing to back this up other than a love of pirates and a firm belief that they will always beat ninjas. Historically in the golden age of piracy, freebooters had letters of marque from different nations, where basically they were legal piracy. As long as you don't attack our ships, you can attack anybody we're at war with.
Yeah, they're mercenaries.
I'm imagining that the same possibility could come into play between religious leaders, popes, whether they're French or Italian, say yes, any Muslim ships on the Barbary coast and the west of Africa are fair game. The caliph, the kings of Andalusia and Mali and Mansas say Christian ships are fair game. So I wonder if this becomes then a real one sort of romantically pirate affiliated, but also very dangerous kind of strait that people have to run almost like a gauntlet. And that then I wonder if that's going to lead into some of the explorers that we know later on down the line, your Magellans, your Drakes, those kind of guys being cut off from the Horn of Africa and then having to go straight west.
They got to go west. Yeah.
That then changes your list of players who were in North America, because you can't really go south unless you have a whole, Spanish treasure fleet's worth of guns to keep you through this sort of, strait between Mali and Brazil. Yeah.
That's actually really fascinating to think about the implications of that. And I think that, and it might not have been the Malian Empire per se. Like it might have been,
may have been the Songhai.
It might have been the Songhai.
I think any number of successors.
Well, any number of successor states. But I think the point is whatever West African empire that would have ended up taking over, they could have, in a sense, like finished the job that Musa was intending on accomplishing. That is, building up these Islamic centers of learning. Musa was really instrumental in bringing like all of the architects, all of these scholars all across the Islamic world, bringing them into his fold. And that's how, the Malian Empire's reputation really ended up, just growing and burgeoning. So, but if we're having this, Mali Empire is unstable, the Catholic Church, situation at this point being pretty unstable, then just leading into this sort of accelerated new world exploration, but with religious pirates attached to it. That is actually a pretty plausible scenario, I feel.
All right, somebody's going to have to write a whole historical fiction series in this world that we just created about these sort of, Southern Atlantic pirates going on in wars of religion. That's too good. You have to give us credit, but you can right away anybody who needs a new book to write.
Yeah, 100%. We just kind of gift wrapped you the perfect sort of material, the perfect touching off point on that. I think I think as we start bringing this to a close, I think something that I mentioned towards the beginning of the show, and I think also bears repeating here again. I think I'll say this shout out to Helena Nash, who tends to think about the cultural implications, the pop culture sort of things. But I did mention that Abu Bakr II was the inspiration for the Lion King. So I think if Musa was not as famous as he was, there is a distinct possibility that we would have ended up not having the Lion King story, because, and hear me out here, Abu Bakr was trying to get across, to the New World, and we don't know if he actually ended up doing so. So we would have probably ended up having stories about who actually did end up getting across the strait. And it would have been much more focused on, the sort of, it would have been more pirate themed. It would have been more, along those lines. So honestly, and now as I take a step back, and I'm just kind of maybe going to drop this little mini nuke as I back away slowly, is so I said earlier that maybe Europe would not have had and the West in general would not have had as strong of understanding of Africa, because we already have these sort of, pictures in our head, our stereotypes of Africa being this monolithic sort of, you would tend to think of it. I think if you'd mention the continent of Africa to most people on the street today, they would probably think of things like, areas in Kenya or Tanzania, like the safaris, like that kind of stuff. But if we have Africa being more relevant in this kind of, global exploration sort of sense, then the story, the Lion King story, would not have ended up being about the Lion King. It probably would have ended up being about and being a whole different story. And we can mix in any number of seafaring, sea-based sort of Disney films, lump them all into here and kind of, mix up all those plots and try to make something that tastes good on a pop culture sense. But I don't know, a lot of times, history repeats itself, and history does provide the backdrop or the inspiration for a lot of these kinds of, fun stories. So I think, so this one's for you, Helena Nash, trying to think through the pop culture implication. Probably no Lion King, because Abu Bakr we really only know Abu Bakr, I think, because of Mansa Musa, because Mansa Musa was famous. If both he and his descendant were not really super well known on their own right, I don't know. It either would not have happened, or maybe it would not have been as popular as it is today. I don't know.
Well,
that's just a thought I'm going to
Even Batuta famously, I think, wrote one of the earliest medieval descriptions of a hippopotamus when he was traveling through Mali. So maybe instead of Lion King, it's Hippopotamus Hero.
Hippopotamus Hero. I like that. And
I think that might be the episode title.
You know what? I think that sounds amazing. Hippopotamus Hero. I think, what's that meme going around right now? And I hate inserting memes necessarily. I love memes, but inserting them unnecessarily into context, because then that kind of dates things a little too much. But I will just say hippopotamus, of course, reminds me of Mudang, which is the little baby hippo that's going around right now.
Maybe as an alternate title we have Mudang Musa or Mansa Mudang.
Mansa Mudang, maybe. I don't know. We got to juice the algorithm somehow.
Yeah, we'll do that as the subtitle of the episode. We'll have a two-parter, so it's kind of like our Al Gore episodes. Helena Nash had a couple of good numbers for those, and I came up with some terrible, sequel titles like Gore Hard, Gore Harder, and the Regorning.
Harder, yeah.
So maybe this will be that.
Yeah, before we recorded this episode, I was listening. I'm catching up a little bit on episodes. I was listening to the Madam President episode. So, yeah, I think we got a good game going on here.
All right. Well, I think that is about it. So we've taken one small man, one poor, well, not really very poor,
not really small,
one rich man's poor adventure, and made it. We've Oregon trailed him into somehow creating a medieval wars of religion pirate strait between West Africa and Brazil that Francis Drake was too afraid to get to. So Ladies and gentlemen, if you ever wondered what you could hear on A Fork in Time and what you couldn't, the answer for what you can't find here is apparently nothing. We will create
nothing.
Any kind of world that you can imagine, as long as we, don't ever kill John F. Kennedy in one.
Yeah.
So I guess, Evan, you got any last final thoughts now that we've gotten Mudang out of the way?
Not particularly. I think this is a pretty fun, interesting episode to think through some of those implications. And I definitely want to keep looking back into this point in history and identifying other potential forks because, yeah, this is one that we're not really taught as much in schools. And I think has a pretty, interesting set of implications. And it kind of asks the important questions of, well, why don't we know more about these supposedly like important people in this time in history? And I think it's because, well, as the adage always goes, history is written by the victors. And I feel most of African history has kind of been, for two main reasons, kind of pushed to the wayside. Most of it was oral traditions, oral history, and we are mostly a written culture now. So that's kind of one main reason. But the other reason is that Europe, colonized Africa during the 18th and 19th centuries. And so Europe was, in that sense, the victor. And thus we kind of view African history as like nothing happened until the 1700s and 1800s. And that's really not the case. There really is a lot of rich history that I want to learn more about. And so, hopefully this episode encourages you guys to do the same thing. Go back, see maybe some other possible forks that we don't know about right now.
Yeah. I think that is the perfect segue into reminding everyone about our Discord. Listeners, if you have any other alternate forks, we have a topic queue that we're trying to run through all of the various different listener suggestions that we have from the Discord. But if you have any thoughts on this episode, any other episodes, or any other forks, especially like Evan said, that aren't in our kind of typical World War II wheelhouse, especially sort of non-Western Europe, medieval stuff. If you've got forks from throughout Asian history or African history, or just any weird fork you want to throw out of us. We've blown up Confederate generals on a boat. We've saved any number of presidents from death. We've kept presidents from being saved from death. So we will take all comers. Feel free to throw whatever you want at us on our Discord, and we will do our best to try and get around to an episode. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, and Evan, if you come across a fork in time, what do you suggest that we do with it?
Take it.
All right, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Until next time.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.